LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Philip Coggan, who joins us to discuss his book, Money, Debt and the New World Order. In today's financial climate, we are all, naturally, obsessed by debt. In almost every aspect of our life, we experience it, on our credit cards, mortgages, bank loans and student loans. But where has this debt come from and how does it work? What is any money really worth, and what promises do we need to believe to keep the whole system afloat? In a fascinating look at money through the ages, including our own unstable future, Philip examines the flawed structure of the global finance systems as they exist today and asks, with deeper imbalances that the world is currently facing, what's actually at stake? Hello and welcome, Philip, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Philip, today we're going to talk about the nature of money, the state of the world economy, amongst other things, much of which are discussed in your book, Paper Promises, subtitle Money, Debt and the New World Order. Perhaps to launch into this, we could just say some general things. I mean, over the ages, money has been many things. It was gold and silver for millennia, and then more into the modern age, it was backed by gold and silver. Then it was sort of somewhat backed by gold and silver, and now essentially is no longer associated with it at all. And when the link between precious metals and fiat money was lost, there was an explosion in the amount of money in circulation, paper money, electronic money, all crucially, most of it anyway, created as debt. This pumped into the system, but always has to be paid back with interest. And it's this background that has led essentially, it is at the root of the current crisis we're now experiencing.
Yes, I'd just like to clarify that it doesn't all have to be paid back with interest. Of course, notes and coins are notionally backed by the British government. If we didn't believe the British government was going to survive, then we wouldn't use their notes and coins. But they don't have to pay any interest on them. It's free money for governments. But yes, the vast bulk of money, the money that we use that comes from the banks, which are the ones who create most of our money, that is debt in the sense that it's a liability of the bank.
Well, I suppose a lot of people have the idea that they're familiar with the notes and coins in their pockets and in their wallets, but they maybe don't realise how small a percentage that is of the money supply.
Exactly. It's a few percentage points at most. The vast majority of money exists really in electronic form. So every time you or I buy a good over the internet, a book or shopping from Sainsbury's or whatever, it's just a transfer from one bank account to another, and this has shown up, most notably with quantitative easing, this policy that central banks have been pursuing in the last few years, in which when they buy bonds, they credit the bank account of the seller with new money. So it's like a sort of benign computer hacker has got into your account and added some zeros to it. And that money is as good as anybody else's money, as good as a £5 note or a £1 coin, or indeed a gold bar in terms of buying stuff in the shops.
Now, over the ages, money has evolved various distinct roles, principally as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and also a store of value. And it seems that these have often competed against each other in certain ways, that they're not always complementary, depending on what the creator or issuer of money really intends it to be.
Yes, it's a central point of my book. So I think the two primary purposes are the means of exchange and the store of value. Unit account is useful, but if you think about the means of exchange, if next time we queue from a Starbucks, if you had to persuade the lady to listen to your podcast, or I had to give them a lecture on the outlook for the financial markets. It would be a very slow process of exchanging goods. So having some medium that we can use to replace barter is very helpful. And, of course, the more of that money we had around, the better. So if you want the means of exchange function to triumph, then you want to create more money. But if you want the store of value function to triumph, then you want to limit the amount of money, because obviously if I could bring in the money from my kids' Monopoly set to Starbucks every day, I could buy everybody in the office a coffee and still have lots of money left. But Starbucks would pretty soon get sick of taking my Monopoly money. So over history, we've had periods when we've had rapid expansion of the money supply, and other periods we've had a restriction on the amount of money that can be created. And it's a cycle. At times when there isn't enough money around, people are urging more money to be created. And at times when there's too much money, people are arguing that central banks need to get a grip and control the process. And every so often we go through one of these crisis periods, and this has been one in the recent years.
Now, I've talked to a great many members of the public about the nature of money and everything that kind of extends from that. And they're aware of government borrowing because they hear about it in the mainstream media, the need to get it down or the need to increase it to fulfill some function. They also understand governments engaging in quantitative easing. They perhaps don't understand the process, but again, that's in the mainstream media. Then they see pictures of the Queen on coins and notes, in this country anyway they do, and they appreciate that comes from the government, or is at least sanctioned by them. And in general, there seems to be a confusion about where government gets its money from, who it owes this money to, and where the people or institutions it borrows the money from, where they get it.
Yes, well, you're right. Well, the vast bulk of the government's money, of course, comes from the taxes that they raise from you and I, income tax, VAT. Of course, they have other taxes on corporate profits and so on. But in the height of the financial crisis of 2009, 1 in 4 of the amount of money £1 in 4 pounds that the government spending were being borrowed from the financial markets. And a lot of that money comes from people at home. So the pension funds that we might have through our companies, they buy government bonds, they lend money to the government. Insurance companies do so, and also foreign investors and very sophisticated investors like hedge funds, and for example. But in the recent years, because of this thing called quantitative easing, the biggest single buyer of government bonds has been the central bank itself. So we're in this sort of bizarre process where the government issues debt, and then another arm of the government buys it up, and one bit of the government pays interest to another bit of the government, and indeed in the last year or so the Treasury has asked for the interest back. So even more Alice in Wonderland style, that return of interest has been counted as a reduction in the government deficit. So we're not surprised that people find this fairly confusing, because we've entered a very new period of monetary policy where it is very confusing.
Now, particularly in the current age we're living in, we're all encouraged to live within our means. The government's inability to do this, I mean, what's the history of this? Is this a relatively modern phenomenon, or can we look back in history and see the same thing happening? And what essentially would be, if the government suddenly had to start living within its means, what would the actual effects be?
Well, it's a very ancient phenomenon indeed. Monarchs always found it difficult to raise taxes from their citizens, but always had the need to spend money, often on military adventures, wars, or on their castles. Monarchs could often fall because they failed to raise enough money and tried to impose too high taxes on their populations. Monarchs would often abuse the currency. So the classic thing of the Roman emperors would be to, if they didn't have enough money to pay their troops, they'd be in real trouble. So they would take all the silver coins, melt them down, add some copper or lead, then they'd have more coins, and they could afford to pay their troops. But over time, of course, the silver content of the coins fell quite sharply. So they went from being pure coins, pure silver in 70 AD to only 4% silver by 270 AD. So it became the equivalent of today's 2 and 1p coins. And governments in modern times have generally financed themselves more often by deficits than exactly balancing the budgets. And that's one reason why we have very high levels of debt relative to the size of our economy at the moment, because of the legacy of past deficits by governments. Now, what happens if they try and balance the budget overnight is obviously they have to raise taxes or cut spending. Cutting spending means usually people being thrown out of work that work for the government, or lower benefits for the people who receive income from the government. So that's quite bad for the economy, because those people buy fewer goods, and that means less jobs for workers. If they raise taxes, of course, people are paying more of their money to the government and have less money available to buy goods, and again, that means fewer jobs from workers. So the danger of a government that tries to balance its budget too quickly, or in the teeth of an economic downturn, is that they make the economic downturn worse. And if the economic downturn is worse, then taxes will be lower, and they'll probably still have a deficit at the end of it all. So that's really essence of the current debate between the Labour and Conservative parties as to how fast should the government cut its deficit, and Labour Party arguing that by cutting it too fast, they've led to a very slow economic recovery.
So those in favour of shrinking the state, I mean, this is a particularly significant movement in the US with the Tea Party groups, for example. I mean, are they simply a bit, not so much misguided, but do they see the situation rather too simplistically as just we slash government spending and, the debt comes down and our problems are solved?
Yes, I think they often are too simplistic. I mean, I think there's a genuinely good argument to make that in the long run, if the government forms a very large part of your economy, then it's likely to be less efficient. So Sweden, which was a prime example of the social democratic consensus and a very high level of government spending, got up to nearly 70% of GDP, economic output, 20 years ago. And they've gone through a long period of cutting back and brought it down to still quite high levels, but in the 50s% these days. But as a consequence of that, they've managed to improve their economic growth record, and indeed got through the financial crisis rather better than many other countries. So there's clearly some limit to the amount of government spending that you can have. But in the short run, the danger is that the Tea Party people tend to think that there's lots of waste to be eliminated from government spending, when one man's definition of waste is another man's definition of a vital benefit, all too often. And again, similarly, people on the left often believe that if you just tax the rich a bit more, then you'll be able to balance the budget. Well, unfortunately, rich people can move their capital out of the country. If you tax the rich too much, they usually avoid the taxes or work less hard and just earn less income in the first place. So we have to face the fact that if you want to cut the deficit significantly, the bulk of people will probably have to pay more in tax, or a lot of people will have to suffer in terms of lower benefits or losing jobs in the public sector.
You mentioned monarchs rising and falling. It seems almost, slightly perverse perhaps, it seems almost in feudal times that, I won't say people were better off as such, but the system was a little bit different when you had kings wanting to, to tax the peasants, but they couldn't, only so far they could go, because they were looking to basically hand something on to their heirs, and this was a very sort of long-term form of thinking, and contrast with governments of today, which are generally speaking very, very short-term. It's just literally one term to the next, and they know that, well, in a sense, they just need to manage whatever crises are currently unfolding until they get to the next election. Maybe they could have got a strategy for trying to win it. If they don't, then the ball is passed to, between red and blue, and it's their job to just get us through the next 4 years. And that sort of lack of long-term thinking seems to be part of the problem as well.
Yes, funnily enough, that is the subject of another book I've written on the problems of Western democracies. But you're right to say that is a modern issue to do with the short-term nature of government terms, and the fact that our children don't have a vote, so we can leave them large debts, and they have to wait until they're 18 to vote to do something about it. And of course, the unborn children don't get any chance at all to register their protest. It's very difficult to know what's to be done about it because, of course, for the last 50 or 60 years, by and large, things have worked out. So governments have get into deficit economies have then grown, the deficit has disappeared, the debt has fallen relative to the size of the economy, and things have moved on. Why it's a particular problem right now is that throughout the developed world, the baby boomers who were born between 1946 and 1964 are getting ready to retire, so we will have fewer workers, and it's very hard to make the economy grow fast if you have fewer workers. So we have all that debt and the prospect of fairly limited economic growth going forward. And as a consequence of that, it's hard to see that debt being eliminated in the benign way that it was eliminated in past cycles. So that leaves us with some fairly unpleasant choices, which I describe as inflate, stagnate, or default. So you can do what the old monarchs used to do. You can debase the currency, so essentially mean you're paying back the debt with funny money, monopoly money if you like, by having rapid rates of inflation. You can be like Japan, where you've had this same problem of demography, aging population, and virtually no economic growth for 20 years. And they've got away with it because they owe the money to their own citizens, but countries like the UK, which owe money to foreigners, it's not as easy to pull off the same trick. Or you can just default on the debt, say, well, we're not going to pay it back, which is what Greece has done, for example. And that has some dangerous consequences in that if you anger your foreign creditors, then they will be less willing to lend you money in future, so that you may find your ability to spend or borrow from the market strictly limited.
Now, some people who've been opposed to or resistant to their own governments, their own countries being in hock to foreigners, and always characterised as quote-unquote greedy foreigners or foreign banks, corporations, whatever it happens to be, they pointed out that, governments can create their own money debt-free, a bit like, as we alluded to earlier, the actual sort of hard currency, the coins and notes are created. And it does seem quite alluring on the face of it as, why not do this? But of course, there's potential hazards in this, in allowing government control over money creation. Famous examples, Weimar Germany, more recently in Zimbabwe. But has that ever been successfully done and managed, or does it tend to always go in one direction and end in, if not disaster, then at least unintended consequences?
Well, that's a sort of 64 billion question right now. There aren't really any examples in history of governments doing the kind of thing they've been doing in recent years, or rather I should say central banks doing it, of buying a lot of government debt without it ending disastrously. But that's not to say that it can't succeed this time round, and you have to say we've had 4 years of governments buying, so central banks buying government bonds without creating the kind of inflation that Germany experienced in the 1920s, or anything like it. We still have very low inflation. So what's the explanation for that? Well, as I was saying right at the start of this interview, it's not just governments that create money. The vast bulk of money is created by the banks. So to the extent that central banks are creating money via this quantitative easing, banks are shrinking their balance sheet, which essentially means destroying money by lending less and calling in old loans. So if you think of it like a bath, if the central banks have turned the taps on, then the commercial banks have pulled the plug out, and the result is there's been a sort of balance between the two forces. But a consequence of that is that we've not really done any of the things that I suggested would be a way to get out of the crisis. So we haven't inflated away the debt, we haven't raised wages rapidly, so it's easier for people to pay their mortgages, for example, and nor have we defaulted on the debt, and we still owe pretty much as much as we did before the crisis, albeit the government owes a bit more and the private sector owes a bit less, but as a country as a whole we owe pretty much the same amount. That's why the crisis lingers on, and we still have to have a situation where the central bank is committed to zero interest rates for at least the next couple of years. And bear in mind that the Bank of England has existed for over 300 years and never had to have this low level of interest rates through world wars, Victorian era of low inflation, the Great Depression, all the rest of it. Never had to cut interest rates until below 2% until 4 years ago.
Now, you won't hear much about this in the mainstream, but I've certainly noted a lot of talk about there being some bond markets being in bubble territory, just precisely for the reasons you've pointed out. Yes,
there is a lot of argument about that. So historically, if you bought government bonds on a yield of 2% or below, then you've tended to lose money in real terms. So if you think about it, if inflation, there's a rule of 72, which is very handy. So if inflation is 8%, you divide your 8 into 72, and you know that your money will, prices will double in 9 years. So your money will halve in value over 9 years. So inflation has tended to be a bit more than 2% over history. So if you're just getting 2% on your bonds, then by and large, the purchasing power of your money will erode over time, year after year after year. So that's why it's been a bad deal. 1970s was a classic example. Investors who owned government bonds in the 1970s lost a vast chunk of their savings. The difficulty is, whilst that might make government bonds an obvious sell, investors have to allow for two things. First, the central bank seems willing to buy more government bonds from time to time, and if they buy more, that pushes the price up and the yield down, and so if you're betting on the opposite direction, you may lose out. The other point is that Japan has been in a situation, as I already pointed out, for going on 20 years now, and it still manages to get by with government bond yields of less than 1%. So if you think that this situation must lead to much higher bond yields, you have to explain why we're different from Japan.
Now, thinking back to the big financial crash of 07-08 and Lehman Brothers, which was allowed to fail, apparently to avoid quote-unquote moral hazard, that strategy had to be hurriedly rethunk at the time, and in some ways that was the right thing to do, but all the scrambling around after that to change direction really showed us what the situation we're in and how it's happened before, but it is different this time, certainly in scale and complexity.
Yes, I mean, the figures of debt are just much higher than they were 40, 50 years ago, and it's debt everywhere. So it's not just that the government has debt, the banks have more debt than they used to, companies have more debt than they used to, and individuals have more debt than they used to. So my father, for example, wouldn't have owned a credit card. People who grew up and lived through the 1930s tended not to get into debt, whereas in the modern era, sort of getting your first credit card is like a rite of passage, sort of part of the process of adulthood. People learned to have mortgages, to take out big mortgages on their houses in the 1980s, because eventually house prices would always go up and the gamble would pay off. So we've changed our attitudes towards debt quite significantly over the ages. And the difficulty, again, as I say, is if we don't produce economic growth, then that debt's going to hang around and be a burden for us for a very long period. And I think one of the interesting consequences of this crisis is whether there'll be another sort of generational shift in attitudes. So, in the Victorian era, people were very negative towards debt. If you think of Dickens's novels, sort of Mr. Micawber and his annual income, £20, annual expenditure £20 and sixpence, result misery. So the idea of going to debt always brought you pain. Will we come back to that? When you leave college now, if you're a young person, you've already got student debt, so you may be very look askance to the idea of taking on credit card debt, and you also might not be able to have enough money to buy a flat because you won't be able to save enough to generate the kind of deposit needed to qualify for a loan these days. So we may have changed, maybe going through a complete generational change all over again.
Yeah, changing attitudes to debt are key, really. It's interesting you mentioned not having a credit card. Certainly, I think I got a credit card when I was a student, maybe 20 years ago, because it was thrust at me. There you go, £2,000 to play with, as it were. But thinking back to generations before, I mean, my grandfather always used to say, neither a borrower nor lender be. And one idea I know he would have objected to was the idea of debt being sold. And I've often thought that if we didn't allow debt to be sold or passed on, that would really change things. It sounds hopelessly naive and idealistic, of course, but my grandfather, he used to sell carpets and furniture to people in the local community, and there was never, he would sometimes do it on credit, but the money was always owed to him. He said, okay, there's your three-piece suite. You owe me, whatever it would have been at the time, £100 at £5 a week. And he would literally go round once a week to all these individual people, taking £5 and £10 notes off them, and that kept things honest. But I don't know what you think of the general idea of not selling debt.
Well, the problem would be, I suppose, that if you weren't able to get rid of your debt, you'd be much more cautious about the people you would lend money to. So the ability to, if we're talking about bonds here, the ability to sell a bond and realize the proceeds is what persuades many people to invest bonds, because they might suddenly, have the need for money. Even if it's a pension fund, that might be true if they suddenly face some extra costs. If you were not allowed to sell that bond, then you might not buy it in the first place, and then the cost of borrowing for people who need to raise capital will increase, and that would make the economy less productive, because fewer businesses will get financed if the cost has gone up. So that would be my worry. There used to be laws on usury, and this is coming up again really with the Wonga.com example, and those lasted, for the Catholic Church and even in some Protestant areas, for a very long period. But if you look back at the Middle Ages, they were an economically unproductive era, very little economic growth. One of the reasons for that is that it's very difficult for businesses to get finance. And if businesses can't get finance, they can't grow, and the economy can't grow either.
One of the things, if we're talking about the sort of the human element in this and how people's attitudes come into play, certainly in the wake of the financial crash, we were reminded yet again that human psychology and emotion and even ideology sometimes play a key role in finance and economics, and it's not always hard-headed and rational, sometimes far from it, and that's not often talked about, in my experience anyway, in debates over this.
Well, yes, probably not. I think economists tend to view people as sort of rational men who look to the future and assess all the likely costs and benefits of certain courses of action. But we know that that's not how people are, that they do get exuberant, that they all pile in to buy shares or houses when they think the price is going up. It's sort of the opposite of the Harrod sale idea. Financial assets are ones that you buy when the price is high, not when the price is low. So that's a particular problem. And then, of course, similarly, people can panic when things are going in the opposite direction. So they are desperate sellers when they think the price is going to go down. So these waves of greed and fear lead to the fluctuations in the market. And the other thing one has to allow for is that when economists assume that people look to the future and try and guess what's going to happen, then most people, of course, have no idea of what's going to happen. And not only do they not know what's going to happen, they don't know the range of probabilities of what's going to happen. So it's one thing saying, if I roll the dice, I know I have a 1 in 6 chance of it being a 3. But what are the chances of the UK economy growing at 2% next year? Is it 20%, 30%, 50%? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows for sure. So it's to make these sort of complex calculations that economists assume is just impossible for most people. So it's not surprising they get it wrong, and that they revise their assumptions when they get some sudden piece of news, and that kind of thing can send the markets into a tailspin, and of course sometimes the economy into a tailspin as well.
Now, in terms of how we got here, the current crisis, your book sets out very succinctly how over the decades that banking regulation was gradually unpicked. There were all the things that were instituted in the Bretton Woods era that went away. Glass-Steagall, for example, it seems when that was repealed, that was quite significant. And the era of also the era of bank managers being, as you point out again in the book, being Captain Mannering type figures, that's completely changed as well. And the whole attitude to finance and investment has changed. And many modern regulators seem to be completely unable to keep on top of the situation. I've got a personal interest in America. I can't remember the name of the organization. I think it might be the CFTC, but somebody is supposed to be investigating manipulation in commodities markets, and they've been, I don't know what they've been doing, sitting on their hands for years, and nothing's coming of it.
Yes, I think you get a period when the financial sector does very well, and then the regulators seem to be content. The gravy train is good for everybody, and standards are loosened. And then there's a crisis, and standards are tightened all over again. So it happened in the 1930s after the Wall Street crash and during the Great Depression, that you had lots of laws introduced in America and finance was clamped down on. And then in the 80s and 90s over here, financial regulations were loosened. Financiers made a lot of money. That made everybody assume that they were smart. and smart people were listened to when they lobbied for more changes in regulations. Furthermore, and of course in America, if you're rich, you can also lobby your congressman and get listened to. So again, that helps to loosen regulations. And there was a genuine belief that markets left to themselves would sort themselves out. And that all came down to earth with a bump in 2007, 2008. To be fair to the regulators, they are attempting to change the rules all over again. So there's a huge, and probably too huge, act in the States called the Dodd-Frank Act, which is designed to clamp down on finance. And more generally across the world, we're requiring banks to have more capital these days. And if they have more capital, that means that in a crisis they're less likely to go bust, and we as taxpayers are less likely to have to bail them out. And also, if they have more capital, by and large, the profits on their that go to their employees will be lower, and we'll see rather less of sort of huge bonuses than we did before.
Now, as we've mentioned, interest rates in the US and the UK and many other countries have been incredibly low now for years, and to the point where it's getting to they're not going to be able to lower them anymore, otherwise we'll be into negative territory. And this, of course, is affecting savers greatly. It's affecting their ability to provide for themselves, which is what we're all being enjoined to do. But looking forward, there seems to be no sign that interest rates can be raised. And I hear a lot of pundits saying they will inevitably have to rise, which seems logical enough. But what would have to change for that to be able to happen?
Well, I think you need to have much stronger economic growth. The little bit of a rebound that we've had that's being discussed at the moment is not strong enough. You need to have 3 or 4% annual growth to get interest rates up again. You'd need to have, or alternatively, you need to have much more rapid inflation, sort of 6 or 7%, so that the Bank of England would start to panic about inflation getting out of control. There's not much sign of that at the moment, and as I mentioned in an earlier answer, it's difficult for the economy to grow very fast for very long, given the demography and indeed the hangover of the debt crisis in the past. So I think we're stuck with very low interest rates for a very long time. And of course, it has been true in the past that in the Victorian era we had very low interest rates for a very long time. So the bizarre period, or the strange period, was the one of the late 80s and early 90s when interest rates were in the double digits. That was a real historical anomaly, and we're only gradually getting used to the idea that you're only going to earn, at best, a couple of % on your savings account if you shop around really hard. Very difficult for old people and other people relying on their savings really to make ends meet in the current circumstances.
Well, yeah, and inflation generally might be quite low, but of course there's the government's published inflation rate, and then there's the actual inflation rate that we experience when we buy things. And there still seems to be some evidence to suggest that a real inflation rate is somewhat higher than the government's stated rate. And the reason I mention this is because a lot of rates, most of it you can get savings rates, are actually below that. So effectively, may not be at a great rate, but you're a great speed, I should say, but you're losing money basically by having it in most bank accounts.
Yes, you certainly are. But I mean, that's part of the point of monetary policy in the first place. Central bankers don't want people to save, they want people to spend, and they do want people to borrow. So they're trying to reduce the rate for borrowers, and that inevitably means a reduced rate for savers. So they are the kind of collateral savers, the collateral damage of the current regime of monetary policy. And I'm afraid, from the point of view of savers, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. You could say, however, that equity markets have done fairly well in recent years. So if you had more of your savings in shares and less in the bank, then you've probably done a lot better.
But yeah, they may well have done better in shares. There's also some evidence to suggest that by whatever method, that a lot of quantitative easing money has ended up in the stock market, and it might be actually somewhat artificially inflated.
Yes, I think that's a genuine worry. I mean, the talk that we've had in the last 6 months that the Federal Reserve will reduce the amount of QE it does. It's a phrase called tapering. It's been a big word in the market in the recent months. It does seem to have caused a bit of a wobble in the US stock market, more significantly in the emerging stock markets, sort of India and Indonesia's And of course that raises the question of whether the central banks can stop QE altogether, or whether, if they do so, they might cause the markets to collapse, which would bring us back to worrying about the events of 2008 and 2009. So again, we've got into this particular policy of zero interest rates and buying assets. It's not so clear how we'll ever get out of it.
Now, things are kind of bad in the US at the moment. In Britain, they've been in poor shape in Japan for decades, as you point out, long before the financial crash happened. But in many ways, the European Union seems to be the nexus of the crisis. Because it's unlike the US states. United States of Europe doesn't really exist in the same way. And within the EU, we've seen tremendous problems in Ireland, in Spain and Portugal, but particularly in Greece, which you point out is essentially facing permanent austerity. But this reminds us that the EU at its root is a sort of a political and ideological project, and in economic terms it was almost certain to fail.
Yes, I think it's not so much the EU as the Eurozone, which was built in to have almost to have failure built into it. So the EU as a trade group did have a strong political motivation, which was the idea by locking Germany into the heart of Europe, we'd prevent the world wars that marred the 20th century. And we have delivered peace and prosperity for 60 or 70 years, but they always wanted to take things further. And you can see the appeal of a single currency. I don't know if you travelled to Europe in the years before we had the euro, but you always ended up coming back with some odd bits of Belgian francs and Portuguese escudos, which were no use to anybody in any other country, and it was just making money for foreign exchange traders every time you had to change your money out of pounds into another currency and back again. But the trouble is, if you have a single currency for an area, it only really works very well if it is a single country. So in the US, if you decide to you don't like living in Massachusetts and you want to go to California, you can hire a truck and drive over there, and you can instantly move into a new job, and it's the same national tax regime, it's the same language, it's the same rules for all employees. But it's not true in Europe. I couldn't go and be a journalist in Poland because I don't speak Polish, and they would recognize I didn't know much about the Polish political system. And vice versa, I suppose, for Polish journalists too. So we also had the problem that different countries had sort of different economic drivers. So by having one interest rate for the whole system, you caused booms in house prices in Ireland and Spain, for example, whereas there was no boom in Germany. And the consequence of that also was that you had these huge build-ups in debt in those economies. In the past, when economies had too much debt, they struggled, they devalued their currencies, which is effectively like a mini default on their debt, and you all started again. But once you're in a single currency, you can't do that. So that's really the cause of the crisis that came up in 2010.
On the face of it, if it looks like the Eurozone is destined to unravel, or at least to contract, in your experience personally, do you think that the euro as a currency will survive? It seems more likely than the group of countries as it is staying completely intact.
It's been an interesting guessing game all through this crisis, and this was a year or two ago, you'd have thought it more likely to collapse than you do now. So what in effect has happened is that Germany realized that it had various ways of paying the bill. It could either have the other countries default, which was a problem for its banks. It could have default and leave the euro, which would be a big problem for its banks. It could send tax subsidies to the other countries, which the voters wouldn't like, or it would effectively lend those countries cheap money for a long time, which was like a tax subsidy, but it isn't as obvious to the voters. And that's the last answer has really been what it's followed. So Germany seems to have recognized that a collapse of the Eurozone would be pretty disastrous, and is willing to go along with subsidies, cheap debt for the peripheral economies. The most likely way that it will break up is if the voters in the peripheral economies get fed up with it. So we've already seen in Greece that we had around a third of the vote going to either Trotskyite parties or fascist parties. And if we got, maybe in a few years' time, if that gets to 40-50%, then the voters will just say enough with this, and we are leaving the euro of our own accord. So the big challenge for Europe is to try and make sure that doesn't happen by reviving those peripheral economies, which will need economic reform policies. But that all makes it very difficult, proposing for economic reforms, which only makes governments popular. So this crisis is as yet unresolved, and there'll still going to be a few nasty patches, I think, before we get through it.
You also point out in the book that the issue here, obviously there's levels of personal debt and corporate debt are high, but in terms of government debt, it's not just the raw figures. It's the unfunded liabilities, which are basically future obligations, typically pensions, healthcare. But as we've noted, governments tend to be ruled by short-termism, and therefore not only have they not been metaphorically putting money aside, it seems that some of the funds have actually been raided for current spending. And this is going to lead to huge problems in future, because as you point out, the situation will arise that some people are just not going to get paid, or they're not going to get the amount they thought they were going to get.
Well, we're already starting to see that. Of course, we've had benefit cuts in Britain. We've had a sort of stealth devaluation of some pensions, whereby people are getting them uprated each year in line with a lower inflation index than they got upgraded in line with before, which over the long term will eat into the value of their pensions. And there are bound to be other ways in which this happens. You cannot both repay your creditors and meet the future promises that you've made to your citizens to pay all the benefits or to keep taxes down. And so this is why this is a central issue. It's not just a financial issue. It's the key issue, really, for politics over the next 10 or 20 years, that, you're pitting old against young, because the young have got the debts that the older generation have left them. You're pitting rich against poor. You're pitting public sector workers against taxpayers. You're pitting one country against another. And in the US, we see the same battle between Republicans and Democrats, between the Republicans insisting that you cut spending, which they call entitlements, pensions, pay for the jobless, healthcare costs, and the Democrats insisting that you increase taxes. This will be resolved in different ways in different countries. Some countries like France might go in the direction of higher taxes, and other countries like Britain and America might go in the direction of lower spending.
In terms of precious metals, we mentioned earlier, they're synonymous with money for eons, and we came off the gold standard, of course, many decades ago. We know what happened after that. But there's certainly a camp now, well, I suppose they've always been there in some form or other, Austrian types arguing for sound money. But there's also many people who say that going back to some sort of gold standard would be calamitous. It would just basically be impossible. But I've also heard talk about gold somehow becoming involved in the monetary system again, in a formal way. And there's been a lot in the news recently about governments buying gold. The Chinese and the Indians recently created some new legislation around the import of gold, and we've seen Germany wanting to get their gold back from the US and having problems with that. So it just seems that it's floating around. It keeps popping up here and there. Do you think there's any prospect of gold ever being formally involved again?
Well, never say never. I don't think it looks very likely at the moment, because it would require governments sort of tying themselves to the mast and avoiding the potential to inflate their way out of the debt, which is a very tempting option. I've had debates about this with various gold enthusiasts, and one of the classic lines that they say is that all paper money systems have devalued themselves to zero, that they've all failed in the past. Well, of course, it's not quite true, because we've had a paper money system for several decades now, and it hasn't completely disappeared. Whereas the one thing we do know is that no country is now on the gold standard. So all gold standards have broken down in the past is definitely a statement you can make. And why do they break down? It's because, going right back to the start of the interview, if you restrict the value of money, which is what restrict the supply of money, which is what a gold standard does, then at certain times this will bite very hard, and it tends to bite very hard on the poorer people in society. And that was fine as far as the creditors were concerned in the 19th century, before we had mass democracy. But once you had mass democracy, the people simply wouldn't put up with it. So in the 1930s, which was the first great example, that one country after another faced with the prospect of continuing depression and accompanying with continuation of the gold standard, said, to hell with it, we're going off the gold standard. And once they went off the gold standard, they found they managed to survive quite well without it. So the only way, I think, in which a gold standard would return is if we did get into the situation of hyperinflation in the future, and people said, well, the only way to restore confidence in money is to link to gold again. And that, I'm not saying that couldn't happen. It is possible. But at the moment, it doesn't look imminent, that's for sure.
The one thing you mentioned in your book, which I rarely hear mentioned in any talk about the financial crash or the world economy or how we got here or where we're going, is the issue of energy. And
yes.
The endless growth model, which basically, the modern industrial economies have been based on, it's impossible to maintain. And money itself has become detached from actual physical resources that we have. And a long time ago, land was factored out of economic equations. But we're now hitting some hard limits in terms of the natural world and resources, and there are emerging energy crises on a number of fronts. Even the peak oil theory, whether you subscribe to it or not, is becoming more and more talked about. It's virtually a conspiracy theory in some circles. But the bottom line is, I think it's really significant that you brought energy into the equation.
Yes, though I have to say that since I wrote the book, the sheer abundance of shale gas in particular makes my view less strong than it was at the time. So the central point is not really that we're at peak oil, but we do discover new sources of oil. We may discover quite a lot under the Arctic, for example, and there's big field off Brazil, for example. But the places where we discover oil, it's more expensive to get the oil out than it was before, and so the physicists talk of this equation of the energy output relative to energy input. So when you were getting oil out of the ground in Saudi Arabia, it basically sort of bubbles very quickly to the surface. It doesn't cost much in terms of energy to get the oil out, and you get a lot of energy bang for your buck, as it were. But when you come to something like tar sands, when you have to sort of boil the sands to get the energy out, you're getting a very large amount of you have a very large cost for the energy you produce, and to the extent with shale oil and gas, that's also true in that you have to do the fracking and you have to pump water in and sand in and then transport everything. So it is a higher cost process than Saudi oil, for example. Then the sort of broader thought really is that why did we have an industrial revolution and escape the kind of Malthusian limits on the economy that we suffered up to about 1700? One reason is cheap energy. We replaced humans and animals to do most of our labor with carbon fuels, and that was an enormous boost to the economy over the last 300 or 400 years. If it gets more expensive to do that, then we might see economic growth constrained. As I say, it looks as if shale gas is getting cheaper to produce, and there's a lot more of it than we thought at the time I was writing the book. So I think that point, while not completely negated, is less of an issue in the short term than I thought it was a couple of years ago.
Oh, well, I mean, I suppose if it's less of an issue in the short term, then that'll fit the politicians perfectly, won't it, really? I mean, they certainly, in the UK anyway, our politicians seem to be in a bizarre situation, caught between the need to cut spending and in some cases doing that, but also promoting growth, and sometimes attempting to do both simultaneously. I mean, the current coalition government in the UK will literally have one spokesman on one segment of the news saying we've got to cut spending, and then talking about growth figures. And the Chancellor was making a speech yesterday about recovery in the economy. And for me personally, it's a bit of a manifestation of some of the limits that I think we're coming up against with the endless growth model.
It's very hard to be sure about that, because if you go back to the 1970s, which I'm old enough to remember, there were lots of predictions about the limits of growth back then, and we've had 30 or 40 years of fairly decent growth since then. A lot of modern products require less in terms of energy than old products used to. And individually, you'd be interested to know that energy use per head in the UK peaked, I think, in 1978. I may be 1 or 2 years out, but it's about that level. So oil demand in the developed world is been falling in recent years. It's the developing world where the big increases in oil demand have been occurring. And we have been able to find new and innovative ways to produce stuff that weren't possible before. So there are things coming through, for example, like 3D printing, which may make a difference in the future. There are things like new advances in medicine that may make it easier for people to work better and longer hours. So I wouldn't want to dismiss all innovation altogether, because people who've done so in the past have failed. But I think the key limit to growth for the Western world is this population thing, that in the end, if you don't have as many workers as you had before, it's very hard to make the economy bigger. And this is a big, huge shift, really, because for the last 300 or 400 years, population has been rising pretty steadily. You have to go back to the Middle Ages, to the Black Death even, to see times when populations have fallen. And that's what's likely to happen, quite significant falls in the likes of Japan, Germany and Italy over the next 30 or 40 years.
We saw the role that the housing market played in the crash of 07-08. Typically, the biggest issue really was the subprime scandal in the US. What do you make of the UK government, who currently seem to be juicing the housing market with various schemes, even though for many people housing is unaffordable, and some have argued that we're looking at, with rising house prices, just going into another housing bubble?
I think it's a genuine risk. If we look at measures of house price valuations, which the Economist does, we're overvalued both relative to incomes and relative to rents. And we never got to a period of being undervalued, despite the fact that we did have a housing setback. So what do we need to happen? We need more houses to be built and more flats to be built. And that's a criticism you can make of government policy and of the austerity policy, that they cut back on capital spending, investment spending, which is the most useful bit of government spending, and didn't cut back so much on current spending. So the best way to deal with the housing problem in the UK is simply to build more houses. We've got to have had a rising population. That's what we need to do, not prop up existing house prices.
Now, this is obviously very, very hard to call, but based on what we've seen so far in the global financial crisis, what might we expect going forward? I mean, we've seen a lot of drama and upheaval, or are we looking at perhaps stagnation? I mean, do you think we're over the worst of the big shocks?
I think we're probably the worst of the big shocks, but I think our outlook is more Japanese than people realise. So we may get the occasional period of decent growth, and then we'll slip back again. So a long period in which people are perfectly prosperous in Japan. It's not a disaster by any case, but a very nice place to live for many people. But you don't get the kind of growth you did before, and you don't get the kind of new industries being created that you get before. And that makes it, of course, difficult for governments to balance their budgets, and difficult for people to feel that prosperous. And I do worry about another factor, which is the sort of widening inequality in the Western world. So if you feel that the system was brought down by the financial sector, and we still have ended up with a system where the financial sector has been propped up by the government, that they're still earning a lot more than the rest of us, that's an endlessly dissatisfying prospect. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing rise in the vote of extremist parties in parts of Europe is that people feel the sort of elite has been running policy for the last 20 or 30 years, and that they've been captured by special interests and not being concerned enough about the ordinary person. And the danger of that is, of course, that more and more people turn to the extremists, because they seem to be the most willing to change policy away from the consensus that centre-left and centre-right parties tend to follow.
Well, with ongoing austerity, widening income disparity, as you mentioned, worries about the future, pensions, how people are going to provide for themselves, people feeling that there's nothing they can do, they save, but they're losing money in the long run. I know you're not on here as a financial advisor, I realise that, but for concerned listeners, what sort of closing thoughts would you offer? I
think you should be realistic about the future. Do not assume that you are going to get rapid pay increases in future years. Do not take on the kind of debt that you might have done 15 or 20 years ago, because you can't count on being able to pay it back with the ease that you might have done in the 80s and 90s. And I think also you should look to diversify the sources of income as much as possible. So if you have a job, make sure that you keep up with your skills, make sure that you think about, if you lost your job, where you might be able to be employed elsewhere. Because I think the way that employment is changing is that people are having these sort of dreaded phrase, portfolio careers, where they no longer work at one employer for a long period, but they put on contracts and work in different companies at different times. So, you need to think of yourself as an individual, almost like a business. What are the skills that I have to offer? How can I protect myself against a downturn? And I think that's something probably people weren't used to doing 20 or 30 years ago.
Excellent. Okay, well, in closing, Philip, perhaps you'd like to tell listeners about your new book, which is just out, called The Last Vote, The Threats to Western Democracy, and if you've got a website and anything else you'd like to share. Oh,
well, that's very kind of you. Yes, it is out from Alan Lane, the publishers, and it touches on some of the themes we've discussed here, which is that people have been disillusioned by politicians, that many of the decisions that even MPs take have been moved away from them and to technocrats, central bankers, the IMF, and people like that, and that this is causing enormous disillusionment, and the danger is that people switch off from politics altogether, in which case their interests won't be considered, or that they turn to extremist parties, as we've seen in Greece. So it's sort of an attempt to be a wake-up call for people that if you despise politicians and you ignore politics, then you'll suffer at your leisure. More people need to get involved. More people need to have their voices heard. More people need to make sure they vote, because if you don't vote, nobody will listen to you. So we can no longer recapture the enthusiasm that we had when we made our first vote, and we see that happen still in countries which get democracy today. But you can treat every vote as if it's your last vote, that if you vote this time, you might get stuck with the person you vote for. So think that you might have got stuck with Vladimir Putin or Hugo Chavez or someone, and don't vote for a protest or a joke candidate, because they might get in.
Excellent. Well, Philip Coggan, thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please check out the website. That's LegalizeFreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.